a brief presentation to describe the 3 different cedar apple rust diseases we have here in Kansas. My name is Megan Canali, and I'm a plant pathologist at Kansas State University. The 3 cedar rusts that I'm going to describe are cedar apple rust, hawthorn rust, and quince rust. And these are caused by 3 different fungal species that are all in the same genus of Gymnosporangium. There actually are some other similar rusts in the Gymnosporangium genus, but these are the 3 that are known to occur in Kansas, and so we'll focus on those. Before I go on, I should say that broadly speaking, there are a lot of other rust diseases on different kinds of plants. And in general, rusts are named for their rusty orange spores that you'll see as we go through this presentation. And these other rusts occur on wheat and roses and a lot of different kinds of plants. But for now, for this presentation, we'll just focus on these Gymnosporangium cedar rusts. They have a complicated life cycle. These fungi go through several different spore stages, which we'll describe as we go through. And they have these 2 different host plants. The fungus requires both a juniper as well as an apple or some kind of apple relatives. So again, we've got the cedar side of the equation, and then the fungus also requires an apple or an apple relative like a crabapple, a pear, or a hawthorn. So what we're calling cedars in this case are actually in the genus Juniperus, and they're not actually true cedars, which is a completely different kind of plant. But Juniperus virginiana has a common name of eastern red cedar, and so that's where the common name of cedar can come from. These rust diseases have a severe effect on the apple, and it can cause some defoliation and plant health issues. And though the symptoms, as you'll see, can be very dramatic on the junipers, these diseases actually have little to no effect on the juniper itself. So we'll start with cedar apple rust. The fungus is Gymnosporangium juniperi virginiani, and this one affects junipers. And then as far as the apple hosts, the primary hosts are apples and crabapples. So in the winter and early spring, what you'll see are these brown brain-shaped galls on the junipers, and they're maybe an inch or 2 in diameter. So again, this is what we see in the winter. In the spring, like in April or May, when we get some wet weather, those galls will start to produce these orange like tubes sticking out, and as the weather gets even wetter, those orange tendrils or tentacles swell even farther, and they're maybe an inch or a little more long. These are called teleal horns, and they produce a fungal spore called a teleospore, which we'll see in detail in just a little while. Here are some other examples of these fully expanded teleal horns that you see during wet spring weather on junipers. This is a juniper that is pretty heavily infected, and I've heard people say that they have thought that all of these orange structures on here are some sort of flowering stage of the juniper, but it's actually fungal growth. The galls and those teleal horns can be active for several cycles of spore releases. So basically when it's wet, those teleal horns will swell up, and they're very gelatinous, and they produce spores, which then go and infect apple trees, and then those teleal horns will kind of dry up again, and then during the next rain event they'll swell up, produce spores again, and it can do this for several cycles of rain events. And again, during these infection periods, they're producing spores that affect apple trees. And they can get pretty gooey. Here are a couple of pictures showing those teleal horns as after they've kind of swollen and shrunk a few times, and they get pretty gooey over time. Here's a picture just showing where some of those um, pretty gooey galls have fallen onto the sidewalk. Okay, so let's take a closer look in the microscope. So what you see if you squish some of those orange teleal horns and look at them on a microscope slide are these spores called teleospores. And you can see that they're kind of orange in color. They're kind of pointy on both ends and they have two cells. And these teleospores are pretty small. If you line them up end to end in 1 inch, you'd have several hundred spores. So these teleospores actually produce another spore type called basidiospores, and I don't actually have a picture of that, but those basidiospores are what actually is released, and those then spread in like a wind-driven rain to affect apples. And this is what the infection looks like on an apple tree or a crab apple. We see these orange leaf spots on the foliage. So here's a pretty heavily infected tree, and again we see these orange leaf spots. Severe infection can lead to premature defoliation, reduced photosynthesis. If we're talking about fruiting apples, this will lead to lower yields and overall weakening of the tree, especially if it happens year after year after year. So on this apple host, or crab apple, the fungus produces another spore type called asiospores, which are released and they spread in wet, windy weather, and they then infect junipers. So here's a closer look at what those asiospores would look like in the microscope. So here, it's a little hard to see, but this is a pretty heavily infected tree, and some of those asiospores have actually kind of rained down or fallen down onto this driveway underneath, and it's almost like a coating of like Cheeto dust, or some sort of snack cheese coating that you might get on your fingers, and that's just from all those asiospores kind of showering down from a heavily infected tree. So we're actually going to go through the whole life cycle again here, all on one slide. We'll start with those brown galls again. In the spring, they produce those orange teleal horns. Here we get production of the teleospores, which then further produce basidiospores. Those basidiospores infect apple, and then later in the summer, those apple leaves will produce asiospores, which then go back and infect the juniper again. Those galls actually take 2 years to develop, and then once they are active, they're only active for 1 year. Okay, so front and center is a cedar apple rust gall, but in the background, there's something similar but a little bit different going on, and this is hawthorn rust, caused by a related fungus, Gymnosporangium globosum. This one affects apple and crab apple, also commonly infects hawthorns, and it also can be found on serviceberry, quince, or pear. So we're going to go through the life cycle of this disease, and it's similar to the cedar apple rust. We'll start with these galls, and you can see that they're smaller, and they're not like necessarily round like a typical cedar apple rust gall would be. So in the spring we get that initial swelling with those teleal horns just starting to come out. Here they are pretty fully expanded. Those are going to produce those teleospores again. Those teleospores produce basidiospores, which infect the hawthorn in this case. The infected hawthorn then produces, the fungus produces produces aciospores on the hawthorn. Those aciospores then go back and infect the juniper again. And those galls can be active for several years. Here is what hawthorn rust can look like during pretty wet conditions when they've started to get kind of gooey. Okay, so the third one I'm going to mention is quince rust, another closely related fungus. And this one has a bigger host range on the apple side, which can include apple, crabapple, pear, serviceberry, quince, cotoneaster, photinia, hawthorn, and others. So here is what the fungus looks like on the juniper, and it's a little different. We don't see any little gall-like structures, but instead there's like an orange crust on the twigs or small branches, and sometimes there's a swelling there. But it's different from those very distinctive galls that you see with cedar apple rust or hawthorn rust. And then when the weather is wet, those swell up to form these kind of gooey orange cushions right there against the twig or branch. So on the juniper, we see that orange is the teleospore stage again. It produces basidiospores, which then infect the apple host. So here we're going to look at some different kinds of symptoms you'll see on the apple side of the equation again. And here we've got some quince rust symptoms on fruit. These pink tubes coming off here are aceo, and those produce those aciospores again, which infect junipers. Here's a really nice image of an aciospore in the microscope. Here are some symptoms of quince rust on the thorn of hawthorn, causing some swelling and distortion there. And here we have some quince rust causing some swelling and distortion on succulent stems. It also occurs on leaf petioles. And here is one of those acea, one of those pinkish tubes that produces the aciospores, which again go back to the juniper. So for managing cedar rusts, one of the best things you can do is to start with a resistant variety, and these are available both for fruiting and flowering apples and crab apples. For the apple or crab apple side of the disease, there are fungicides that you can use to prevent rust, and you might want to consider this if you have a tree that you value that seems to be getting rust year after year and suffering some premature defoliation and loss of leaves and potentially some weakening. But it's important to get the timing right, and this is during the spring when those teleal galls are active. And normally in Kansas, that's going to be in spring, like in April or May. It depends a little bit on the timing and weather of the year, but it's right when those orange galls are active. You want to apply the fungicide to your apple tree maybe 2 or 3 times. 10 to 14-day intervals would be common, and that's to protect the apple tree from infection during the whole the peak time when those orange galls are active on the junipers. But of course you want to make sure you read and understand the label of any fungicide you choose to use. So as far as junipers go, it's really not practical or effective to use fungicides on the junipers. And though the symptoms on the juniper are pretty striking and dramatic, they, for the most part, aren't damaged very much by the disease. So it's better to focus any control efforts on your apples or crab apples. So here we actually have all 3 rusts on the same branch. Here's cedar apple rust, hawthorn rust, and quince rust. So again, that's a brief summary to kind of compare and contrast those common diseases, so you'll know which ones you're seeing as you go out and look at your trees this year.